All right, well, our scripture lesson for this morning comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 43 through 51. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? You will see even greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Well, have you ever wondered how people end up following any given path in life? Well, for me, as a person who is interested in people's stories, I pretty regularly wonder how a person ends up choosing a certain career path, or marrying a certain person, or becomes involved in a certain organization or activity. People choose and follow paths in life for a variety of reasons. When it comes to a career, some people simply seem to fall into it. Maybe they work in the family business as a young person, and slowly as they get older, they take over the business. Or maybe they take a job in high school or happen to take a job out of necessity or on a whim and simply never leave. They just slowly work their way up the company and make a career out of that job. Others, however, seem to have had a very clear sense of what they wanted to do in life for a very long time. So maybe as a teenager or a child, they were impressed by an adult in a particular field and wanted to follow in the footsteps, and so they do. Or maybe as a young person, they find a particular field of study or passion that they really latch onto, and they devote their lives to fulfilling their dream. And still others might have a specific skill set that makes them well suited to pursue a particular career. The point is, people choose or end up in their career for a variety of different reasons. And the same can be said for how people end up marrying a person, getting involved in certain activities, and so on. So whether we are talking about a career path or a marriage or any number of other facets in life, we all choose paths or directions we are going to take for a variety of reasons. Now, as Christians, the path we take is often referred to as calling, right? God calls us to follow a particular path. Now, some aspects of our calling are unique to us as individuals, such as career and marriage and so on. But the primary call of all Christians is the same. And that is a universal call to follow Jesus. And this call must influence and supersede any other aspect of our call. And that's what we will see this morning. And so this morning, we will approach this universal Christian calling by looking at the call of Philip and especially Nathanael. And my hope is that by exploring the call of these two disciples, we will have a clearer understanding of our call as Christ's disciples. So, to begin with, our text opens with the very brief, just one sentence calling story of Philip. Jesus is traveling in Galilee, and he finds Philip and simply says to him, "Follow me." And Philip does just that. He responds right away. And we know he responds to Jesus' call right away because without hesitation, he immediately goes to find his brother Nathanael so that he can tell him about Jesus. He comes to his brother and says, "Hey, we have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." And so Philip responds to his calling right away. And we will come back to this. Nathanael, however, is not quite so eager or willing to accept his call, at least not based simply on the proclamation of his brother. Nathanael does not jump up from his spot under the fig tree and immediately follow Jesus the way Philip did. Nathanael is what we might call skeptical. And we can't really blame Nathanael for this. As I have noted numerous times, there were quite a number of people in those days traveling around and claiming to be the Messiah. And so a measure of skepticism was actually a healthy attribute in that regard. But we also see in Nathanael's response a bit of what we might call prejudice or bias. Nathanael doesn't think anything of importance would come from Nazareth. Now, Nazareth was a rather ordinary, undistinguished village or township, and it had no special claims to fame. And besides this, and perhaps more important than this, Nathanael was from Cana, which was another township or village in Galilee, and kind of similar to Iowa, rural towns, villages in those days tended to develop rivalries with one another, right? Just kind of as an aside, in my previous appointment, there were two smaller towns in the area who apparently had a long history of rivalry and bitterness towards one another. And I was told that in one of these towns there was a war memorial in the center of the town, and the antique cannons were purposefully placed in the direction of that rival town. And so Nathanael's bias or his prejudice against Nazareth may have somewhat impeded an immediate response to his call. But Philip, rather than arguing with his brother or trying to change his mind or trying to convince him that, hey, Nazareth isn't such a bad place, he simply tells Nathanael, "Okay, come and see." And to his credit, Nathanael responds. In spite of his skepticism, he is willing to go and see for himself. And as we see in the story, Nathanael's skepticism very quickly evaporates. When Jesus sees Nathanael coming towards him, Jesus says, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And Nathanael asks him, "Well, how did you get to know me?" And Jesus answers, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." And Nathanael replies, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." So what is it about what Jesus says that almost immediately changes Nathanael's mind and leads him to thus respond to his call? Well, we don't know for sure, other than what Jesus says must have revealed to Nathanael that Jesus could see inside his heart, but we can make a couple of educated inferences. First, Jesus' greeting, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit," was a greeting of Jewish honor. It shows that Jesus can see that Nathanael is indeed a devout Jew. Second, Nathanael was sitting under a fig tree, and sitting under a fig tree was where devout Jewish men would sit and pray and reflect on Scripture. And if Nathanael was like most young Jewish men of the time, he was likely praying for the restoration of the kingdom. He was longing for the Messiah to come and restore Israel. And so it is very possible that what Jesus is saying to Nathanael reveals that Jesus knows Nathanael's innermost thoughts, desires, and longings. His longing for the Messiah. And this is all the proof Nathanael needs. Once Jesus says this, Nathanael replies, "Hey, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." So Nathanael responds to the call of Jesus and begins his journey as his disciple. And then kind of as a further preview of what awaits Nathanael as a result of his faithful response to the call to follow Jesus, Jesus says, "Do you believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? Well, you will see greater things than these. Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." And this, of course, is a reference to Genesis 28, in which Jacob has his famous dream of a stairway or ladder between heaven and earth. And in that dream, the angels are ascending and descending on this ladder, right? You probably learned a song about that when you were kids. So what Jesus is saying is, Nathanael, by following me, you are going to experience and witness heaven on earth. And indeed, Nathanael's calling made him witness to miracles and healings and power and truth that can only be described as heaven on earth. So, what can we learn about the calling Jesus places on our lives through the callings of Philip and Nathanael? Well, as I said in the beginning of the sermon, there are details and specifics about our individual callings that differ. And just as we saw with Philip and Nathanael, we receive our call from Jesus in differing ways. But the most important aspect of our calling is the same. Jesus calls to each and every one of us, "Follow me." Follow me. That is our primary calling, and it is more important than any other aspect of our calling. You know, we sometimes get caught up in the details, and sometimes we do this to an unhealthy extent. And I know this because this has been a struggle of mine. Sometimes we obsess over things like career choices and whether or not to move, whether or not to get married, whether or not to have kids, and so on. But what we sometimes fail to realize is that if we are following Jesus, that is, if we are committed to and investing ourselves in that primary calling, the details won't matter as much. It's not that they're not important, because they are. However, there is great freedom in believing and embracing the truth that if I am committed to my primary calling, God is going to be with me and use me regardless. Now, as I said, I'm far from perfect in this regard. I still struggle with it from time to time. But I can remember when I somewhat turned the corner to some extent in my faith with respect to calling, because I used to obsess over worrying about making the right choice at any given major decision. But at some point I realized that as long as I am committed to this primary calling, to following Jesus, God is going to be with me and use me, even if the details aren't ideal. And this led to a tremendous weight being lifted off my shoulders. Our primary calling is to follow Jesus and therefore become more and more and more like him each and every day. That is the calling that truly matters. So the question becomes then, okay, how do we ensure we are indeed committed to this primary calling? Well, this is where we look at our disciples this morning. First, notice from Philip his willingness to respond to the call of Jesus, right? Jesus says to him, "Follow me," and Philip does just that. And so Philip displays an openness and a willingness to respond to the call of Jesus. And even though Nathanael is a little bit slower to do so, he also responds affirmatively as soon as he meets Jesus. Now, if this morning you have never responded affirmatively to the call of Jesus to follow him, my prayer is that you will do that this very day. And so I pray that you will take the time to sit in silence, like Nathanael did, not right now, but following the service, and commit your life to the high calling Jesus has placed on your life. But for the rest of us who have already responded affirmatively, perhaps we need to reflect on whether or not our lives demonstrate that we have committed ourselves fully to this call. You see, each and every morning, and really each and every moment, Jesus is beckoning us to follow him. And we decide each and every day and each and every moment whether or not we are open and willing to follow him or not. So, for example, when someone is unkind to us and Jesus beckons us to follow him by turning the other cheek, we have to decide whether or not to follow him or repay evil with evil. Or when we see someone in need and Jesus beckons us to follow him by giving generously, we have to decide whether or not to follow him or hoard our resources. When we see violence or lies or injustice around us, and Jesus beckons us to follow him by speaking truth and being peacemakers and loving our enemies, we have to decide whether or not we will follow him or contribute to the sinfulness of the world by responding in the same way as those who have not committed to the calling of Jesus. Each and every moment, Jesus beckons us to follow him. So let us be like Philip and do so immediately and willingly and consistently. Second, again like Philip, we must respond to our calling by inviting others to do the same. Philip's first documented act as a disciple, as a follower of Jesus, is to tell his brother about Jesus and invite him to come and see. The excitement and joy Philip receives from his calling creates a desire within him to share it with others. This is a fundamental aspect of our calling as followers of Jesus. And I think if we're honest, we aren't particularly keen on this aspect of our calling all the time, right? And this could be for any number of reasons. Maybe some of us have lost some of the joy we initially had when we received our calling. Or maybe some of us don't share our belief because it makes us too uncomfortable or scares us. I mean, how many of us would have given up on Nathanael when he initially pushed back, right? When Nathanael made that comment about Nazareth, how many of us would have simply just dropped the subject? But Philip's example is crucial here. Notice he doesn't argue with his brother or try to convince him why theologically the Messiah could indeed come from Nazareth. Rather, he simply invites his brother to come and see. Just come and see. Now, in our context, I think this is quite instructive. Now, there is a place for debate and argumentation, but ultimately it is said at least that no one has ever been argued into the kingdom of heaven. And so the best way for us to show Jesus to others is through our lives. And this is one of the reasons why immediately and willingly and consistently following Jesus is so crucial. Because this is how we invite others to come and see. We invite them to see the difference Jesus is making in our lives. And if I am not following Jesus faithfully, how can I possibly invite them to see him and follow him? Now, this doesn't excuse us from speaking. Each and every one of us must be prepared to share our faith. And this doesn't have to be a supremely articulated treatise on the Christian faith, fully equipped with arguments and apologetics. Rather, this simply means we have to be ready to tell people what we believe, and maybe why, and how Jesus has affected our lives. But then we invite them to see that, to come and see, by actually living that out. Third and finally, there is much we could talk about as far as Nathanael goes. If I had more time, we could look at a few more things. But I'm going to touch on just one thing when it comes to Nathanael. I think Nathanael demonstrates the importance of humility and openness to correction when it comes to the call to follow Jesus. Nathanael is initially resistant to his brother's invitation. He has, as we've seen, a healthy skepticism, so to speak. But he is also very open and very quick to respond to the truth. Now again, if you have never responded affirmatively to the call of Jesus, you likely have reasons for this. Perhaps you are skeptical because you find the arguments against Jesus convincing. Or perhaps you have encountered too many of us who profess to follow Jesus, who have not done so in a faithful and consistent manner. And for my part in this, and perhaps on behalf of the failings of so many of us, especially of late, I apologize. I apologize. Because you are right to be skeptical when you have witnessed so many of us behaving in ways unbefitting of followers of Jesus. But I do pray that, like Nathanael, you will not allow your skepticism to render you unwilling to come and see. And so I encourage you to take time today to sit and ponder and pray for a willingness to encounter Jesus. But for the rest of us who are already committed to following Jesus, humility and openness to correction are fundamental aspects of responding faithfully to our calling. Just because we call Jesus Lord, and just because we are committed to trying to faithfully follow Jesus as we are called to, this does not mean, and never will mean, that we do not need to be ready and willing to hear the voice of Jesus when he calls us to repent. In fact, if we are not willing to admit when we are wrong and change course accordingly and seek forgiveness from God and people who we have sinned against or hurt through our words and actions, we actually aren't following Jesus faithfully at all. I think we have this misconception that admitting fault is a sign of weakness, or that admitting we were wrong reveals we have weak faith. But I offer to you, be very wary of the professing Christian who is slow to admit fault and refuses to take responsibility, because such a person thinks far more highly of themselves than they ought to. When Nathanael encountered Jesus, what did he do? He admitted he was wrong. He exclaimed, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." and he committed himself to following Jesus for the rest of his life. Likewise, in order to be faithful followers of Jesus, we must be ready to humbly admit when we are wrong and willing to change in order to respond more faithfully to the calling Jesus places on our lives. Jesus has indeed called each and every one of us to the highest and holiest calling there has ever and will ever be. And that is the call to follow him. The question for us this morning is, will we do so in the same kind of way as Philip and Nathanael?